I ran into an old friend at a cafe the other day. He had that unmistakable look of someone deep in training, focused, a little tired, water bottle, timer on the table. So naturally, I asked him what he was preparing for. I figured, a marathon, maybe some intense fitness thing. He just looks up, smiles, and slides what he was working on across the table. And it wasn't a workout plan. It was a newspaper, folded to a Sudoku puzzle, absolutely covered in these meticulous pencil marks. He says this: "My coach says I need to shave at least 30 seconds off my average time by next month." And he wasn't joking. He started talking about it with the same intensity, the same jargon, as a runner talking splits or a weightlifter about their PBs. He mentioned cognitive reps, memory fatigue, and how doing a daily crossword is his cool down. That whole conversation really made me think. We all know about taking our bodies to the gym, right? But it hadn't really clicked for me that so many people are taking their brains there too. And it turns out this isn't just some quirky hobby. This idea of brain exercise through games, well, it's backed by some pretty serious science. And it might actually be one of the best investments you can make for your future. Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. This core idea that we can condition our mental hardware through strategic engagement. It's pretty profound. The whole concept of cognitive reps and pushing past memory fatigue. It sounds like athlete talk, yeah, but it's actually rooted in some serious neurobiology. So our mission today is to really explore how this works. How does consistent strategic engagement drive these measurable cognitive changes across your entire lifespan? How does it give you a real competitive advantage, whether you're, say, 10 or 80?
Exactly, and we're really diving into the mechanisms here, the why behind this mental workout. We're structuring this deep dive around, let's say, 3 critical areas where this kind of strategic training really matters. First, understanding how to build genuine biological resilience against age-related decline, keeping sharp as we get older. Second, how structured games like chess can systematically improve academic performance and those crucial executive functions in younger minds. And finally, how modern digital tools, these brain apps, can help adults master very specific functional skills for everyday life. We're going to show how consistent, structured mental effort translates directly into measurable brain function, efficiency, and real long-term resilience.
That long-term resilience you mentioned, that brings us straight to probably the most fascinating and sometimes kind of counterintuitive concept in this whole field, cognitive reserve, CR. You hear about it as the brain's amazing ability, almost paradoxical really, to keep functioning even when there's significant neurodegenerative stuff going on underneath.
Yeah.
Like the plaques associated with Alzheimer's disease building up. It's like the engine light is flashing, but the car just keeps cruising smoothly down the highway. And this reserve, it's built up over a lifetime, right? Through intellectual challenges, education, complex jobs. Right. But this is where we need to be precise, because reserve itself can be a bit of a loaded term. Cognitive reserve, CR, is the active component. It's about the differences in cognitive processes, how flexible, how efficient, how adaptive your neural circuits are when they face damage. And that's all shaped by experience. CR, it's essentially about strategy. Think of it like this. If a major neural highway in your brain gets closed down because of disease, a high CR brain strategically reroutes the traffic. It uses back roads, maybe even builds new routes. Okay, so it's less about just having more raw brain matter, like a bigger hard drive, and more about having a smarter, more efficient operating system that you've installed through learning and experience. That seems like a really key distinction.
It absolutely is, especially when you contrast it with what researchers call brain reserve, or BR. BR is the passive part. It's quantitative. Think of it as your factory-installed hardware capacity. Total brain volume, the sheer number of neurons you started with, your initial synaptic density. If you have a larger neural infrastructure to begin with, you have a higher passive BR. It gives you a physically larger buffer against pathology before you start seeing impairment. So yeah, CR is the software, BR is the hardware. And then there's this third concept, relatively newer, called brain maintenance, or BM. This shifts the focus a bit. While reserve theories, both BR and CR, focus on compensating for damage that's already there, maintenance theories emphasize the neuroprotective mechanisms. These are factors that actually help prevent the pathology, things like inflammation or the buildup of toxic proteins from happening in the first place. So for optimal aging, you really want all 3 working together. Robust hardware, BR, efficient software, CR, and an active protection system, BM.
It sounds like having high CR is definitely the goal then. But you mentioned a catch earlier, something powerful called the CR paradox. The idea that high reserve can be a double-edged sword is, well, it's startling.
It is startling, and it's one of the most critical clinical observations in this whole area of research. See, individuals who've built up a really high cognitive reserve have such robust, efficient neural networks they can remain completely asymptomatic. They can perform perfectly on cognitive tests, even while a massive amount of Alzheimer's pathology, like plaques and tangles, is accumulating under the surface. They're just too good at masking the disease through compensation.
Wow. I can immediately see the clinical challenge there. By the time a noticeable symptom finally pops up, the underlying disease must be incredibly advanced.
Precisely. They compensate beautifully, sometimes for years longer than someone with low CR would. But, and this is the paradox, once that reserve capacity is finally exhausted, when those compensatory circuits just can't handle the load anymore, the onset of symptoms is often sudden. It can be quite dramatic. And the cognitive decline tends to progress much, much more rapidly. They can go from seeming completely normal to deteriorating very quickly, simply because the disease has been silently advancing while they were masking it through sheer mental effort and efficient brain strategies.
Which makes early diagnosis in these high CR individuals incredibly difficult.
Extremely difficult. It's a major challenge for clinicians.
Okay, so if CR is the strategy, the brain's ability to reroute and adapt. What's the biological engine driving this? It must come down to the brain's physical ability to change itself, right? Synaptic plasticity.
That's the absolute foundation.
Yes.
Synaptic plasticity is the core biological process. It allows your brain to physically remodel its circuits in response to learning, experience, challenge, even injury. CR basically leverages this plasticity. It recruits alternative neural pathways when the primary circuits start to fail because of disease. And the primary beneficial mechanism that underpins this adaptive rewiring is something called long-term potentiation, or LTP. Think of LTP like this. You have a heavily used footpath between 2 points. Through repeated use, that path gets wider, smoother, eventually paved, turning into a high-speed multi-lane highway. Neurologically, LTP strengthens the connections between specific neurons through repeated stimulation. This makes their communication faster, more efficient, and longer-lasting. It's absolutely essential for memory formation and learning, and studies consistently show that individuals with high CR demonstrate greater LTP efficiency. That's what fuels that powerful neural compensation we were just talking about.
Okay, so LTP is building the compensatory highway. But what happens if the damage is so severe that the brain is constantly demanding maximum effort from these backup routes? You mentioned a risk of exhaustion.
Right, that's where the potential downside kicks in. The risk of maladaptive plasticity. When high CR individuals have to constantly, excessively over-recruit these alternative pathways to compensate for severe underlying damage, those backup systems get pushed way beyond their sustainable capacity. This prolonged, intense activity can actually lead to network exhaustion, synaptic fatigue. The very mechanisms that were helpful can, under extreme stress, become maladaptive. Essentially, the beneficial plasticity can flip, turning into a process that actually accelerates the failure of the whole neural network once the system's capacity is just completely overwhelmed.
Wow. So the goal isn't just to boost plasticity, but to do it in a way that's sustainable, providing the molecular support needed to prevent that kind of burnout. What biological levers do we actually have to influence this delicate balance?
Probably the single most critical molecular lever we know of is a growth factor called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. You can think of BDNF as, well, it's essential fertilizer and growth promoter for your neurons. It's fundamental. BDNF promotes the growth of new dendritic branches, those little extensions that receive signals. It encourages synaptogenesis, which is the creation and stabilization of new connections between neurons. And crucially, it also acts as a potent neuroprotector. It helps shield neurons from the direct toxic effects of things like amyloid beta, which is heavily implicated in Alzheimer's.
Okay, BDNF sounds vital. Is this something we can actually influence through our behavior?
Yeah.
And how much does our genetic makeup predetermine our BDNF capacity?
That's the good news and the slightly more complex news. BDNF levels are typically higher in people with greater CR, which really underscores its role in building that resilience. However, our capacity isn't uniform. Genetics definitely plays a significant role here. For instance, there are specific variations or polymorphisms in the BDNF gene itself. One well-studied one is called Val66Met. People with the Met variant tend to have reduced activity-dependent release of BDNF. It's harder for them to get that boost when needed. And then other genetic factors, like the famous APOE4 allele, which significantly increases Alzheimer's risk, can compound the challenge, potentially affecting how the brain utilizes BDNF or handles pathology. So you could say genetics sets your potential range, maybe the ceiling for how much BDNF you can produce or utilize effectively. But, and this is key, your environment and your lifestyle choices heavily determine how much of that potential you actually express and benefit from.
Okay. So even if your genetics aren't perfect, you're not just stuck. Lifestyle choices become critical interventions. These are essentially non-pharmacological ways to boost and sustain CR. What are the proven strategies here?
There are three really well-documented pillars for this. First, cognitive activities. And we're not just talking about, simple crossword puzzles, though they might help a bit. Think about structured learning that really demands engagement across multiple brain domains. Things like acquiring true bilingualism, mastering a musical instrument to a high level, or engaging in complex strategic problem solving like high-level chess, Go, or even complex programming. These activities force different brain regions to work together in novel ways, and that's a powerful stimulus for plasticity.
Okay, challenging cognitive work. What's the second pillar?
Second, physical activity. This one is basically non-negotiable for brain health. Regular aerobic exercise, getting your heart rate up, and also resistance training, like lifting weights, are proven BDNF boosters. Physical exertion stimulates hippocampal neurogenesis. That's the growth of new neurons, specifically in the hippocampus, the brain's key memory center. And consistently, physical activity is linked to measurable improvements in executive functions, things like planning and decision-making and processing speed, especially in aging adults. It literally prepares the biological soil for new neural growth and connections.
Makes sense. Body and mind are connected. And the third pillar?
Third is diet and metabolic strategies. This ties heavily into that brain maintenance concept we mentioned, protecting the brain from damage in the first place. Certain dietary patterns, like the Mediterranean diet, rich in things like omega-3 fatty acids from fish, antioxidants from fruits and vegetables, healthy fats from olive oil, seem to reduce neuroinflammation. And inflammation is really corrosive to synapses. Even some metabolic strategies like intermittent fasting or caloric restriction have shown promise in animal models and some human studies for increasing BDNF production. The hypothesis there is that introducing a mild controlled metabolic stress acts as a kind of beneficial challenge, what's called hormesis. It triggers the brain's own protective and repair mechanisms, helping to sustain synaptic health and potentially delay neurodegeneration.
So it really boils down to strategic investment in your own biological defenses through lifestyle. And seeing the payoff of those long-term investments, well, it can be incredibly powerful, even profoundly moving. I actually came across this really touching story about an elderly gentleman in Kyoto, Japan. His name was Kenji. For 70 years, literally 70 years, his entire world revolved around the strategic board game Go. He wasn't just a player. He was a local legend, a master known for his incredible patience and meticulous deep planning. But, as he got into his late 80s, the inevitable started happening. A sort of fog began rolling in. He started forgetting names, conversations would trail off, they became elusive. And his family was understandably heartbroken. They were watching this defining strategist of their lives start to disappear into the haze of cognitive decline. Eventually, his granddaughter had an idea. She brought him an iPad with a simple Go application on it, just hoping it might spark something, some connection. Now, initially, Kenji was dismissive. He missed the feel, the smooth texture, the satisfying click of the actual Go stones on a wooden board. But the pattern of the board, that complex geometric grid, the black and white stones creating these intricate life and death scenarios, that was a language deeply embedded in his mind. He understood it implicitly. So he started playing against the AI. And the game forced him to do what he'd always done: focus, anticipate multiple moves ahead, plan hierarchically. And his family started noticing something remarkable. On the days he spent time engaged in that concentrated strategic play, even on the screen, his conversations were noticeably clearer. He'd suddenly share a sharp memory of a famous Go match from decades ago, or offer a really crisp, insightful comment on current events, showing a flash of his former self. That game, even in its digital form, it acted like a bridge back to his fundamental identity, providing this familiar cognitive pattern that seemed to cut through the confusion of his fading memory.
That's a beautiful illustration, really. It highlights that the value of high CR, or maintaining cognitive engagement, isn't just medical. It's not just about delaying symptoms, it's existential. Maintaining those complex, domain-specific cognitive skills helps preserve not just function, but the very essence of who that individual is, their sense of self, their mastery, their connection to their own history. That sustained engagement was likely maintaining the specific neural pathways that underpin his most complex and characteristic thought processes.
Absolutely. It's about preserving identity. Now, let's shift gears completely. Let's look at the other end of the age spectrum, how these structured strategic games can build essential skills in young people. We've seen this huge global push in recent years to integrate games like chess into school curricula. This isn't just for fun. It's an explicit attempt to harness that idea of skill transfer, specifically for executive functions.
Right, and this brings us to some core research looking at skill transfer in educational settings. We examined a study that focused specifically on junior high students. It investigated the relationship between their achieved chess skill level and their performance in mathematics. The underlying assumption, of course, is that the kind of thinking required in chess logical reasoning, pattern recognition, planning several steps ahead, should have a strong cognitive overlap with the skills needed for advanced mathematical problem solving.
Makes intuitive sense. So what did the data actually show? How strong was that connection?
Well, the study did find a positive correlation, which is definitely encouraging. But, and this is important, we have to look at the specific coefficient they found. Rho equals 0.167. So statistically significant, yes, there is a relationship. But quantitatively, that's considered a weak correlation. It supports the idea that some of the underlying logical processes do transfer, sure, but it also clearly signals that teaching chess isn't some magic bullet that will automatically fix poor math performance. The effect is real, but it seems to be limited in its overall magnitude. The demographics from that study were also quite revealing. Most of the students were around 13 to 14 years old. And the sample was overwhelmingly male, which unfortunately still reflects a pretty common trend in competitive chess participation. As you'd expect, chess skills varied significantly by age, grade, gender, and how often they played. But here's a really critical positive finding. The students' chess skill level did not show a significant correlation with their socioeconomic status. This is really important because it emphasizes the potential of these kinds of strategic games as cognitive equalizers. They can provide high-quality cognitive training potentially regardless of a student's family income or background.
That's a huge plus. But going back to that weak correlation with math, it suggests there might be a gap, right? A gap between knowing chess strategy and consistently applying it effectively, perhaps under pressure, which might be closer to what a math test demands. What specific chess skills were these students actually assessed on, and where did they tend to fall short?
Yeah, the assessment was quite detailed. It broke down their chess competency into 3 distinct categories. First, cognitive skills. This was things like knowing the rules, understanding basic positional concepts, recognizing piece values. Here, the students were rated as much skilled. They generally understood the strategic blueprint of the game. Second, technical skills. This included things like knowing standard opening principles, recognizing common tactical patterns, basic endgame knowledge. Here, they were generally rated as skilled. They grasped the standard sort of textbook maneuvers, but the lowest rating, where they were classified as less skilled, came in practical skills. This category focused entirely on execution during actual gameplay. Things like managing their time effectively on the clock, adapting their tactics flexibly when an opponent did something unexpected, and maintaining accurate calculation under the pressure of a real game. This really highlights a profound and very common problem, not just in chess, but in learning generally. Students often grasp the theory, the abstract knowledge, but they really struggle with consistent, accurate application and disciplined execution, especially when the cognitive load gets high or time is running out.
That execution gap feels fundamental. It's something many educational approaches arguably fail to address adequately. The bridge between knowing what to do and actually doing it effectively under real-world constraints. If they understand the theory but can't manage their time, or they can't inhibit making a rash, impulsive move, then the transfer benefit to something like a high-stakes math test is naturally going to be limited, which probably explains that relatively low correlation coefficient you mentioned.
Precisely. It tells us that if you're designing a chess curriculum aiming for cognitive transfer, you can't just focus on teaching strategic knowledge. You have to heavily emphasize training those core executive functions, things like impulse control, inhibition, sustained attention, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. Those are the skills that bridge the gap between knowing the theory and performing well in practice.
And the million-dollar question always comes back to transfer, doesn't it? Does playing chess give you a broad, generalized boost in intelligence, or are the benefits much more specific to tasks that share similar underlying cognitive demands?
Yeah, that's the perennial debate. We looked at findings from another rigorous study involving a 30-hour chess training program, this time implemented with primary school children. The results strongly suggest that the transfer is indeed highly specific to tasks that share overlapping strategic and planning demands. The program significantly increased the children's ability to represent and categorize a math problem. They got better at breaking down a complex mathematical scenario into its logical parts, analyzing the relationships between the elements, which is quite analogous, actually, to analyzing a complex chess position. But here's the crucial counterpoint. That very same 30-hour chess intervention did not lead to improvements in unrelated areas, like their ability to recall details from a written text they read, their reading comprehension skills, or general study study strategies like motivation or how organized they were. This really confirms that chess training acts more like a focus tool, a scalpel perhaps, for honing specific executive functions related to planning, strategy, and problem representation. It's not a blunt instrument that boosts general intelligence across the board for unrelated linguistic or motivational tasks.
Okay, so it's a focused intervention for structuring thinking, for managing complexity. Which brings us neatly to the story of David. David was this 10-year-old kid, described as bright, definitely, but utterly chaotic. His teachers noted he had these really rapid but disorganized thought processes. This manifested as poor impulse control, constantly interrupting in class, turning in messy, disorganized assignments, just generally struggling with structure. Now, in his particular school environment, chess was actually a mandatory part of the curriculum, and David initially hated it. He hated the game precisely because it enforced all the things his internal state seemed to resist: discipline, taking turns, quiet focus, thinking before acting. He apparently made rash moves constantly, driven by this impulse for immediate action. He'd sacrifice pieces unnecessarily, just wanting to do something rather than planning. But his teachers saw something important. They recognized that the game itself, specifically through its immediate and clear feedback loop, provided the very framework, the external structure that David desperately needed.
So when he made a bad impulsive move and instantly lost a valuable piece?
Exactly. He immediately experienced the negative consequence of poor planning or poor inhibition. There was no ambiguity. The game forced him to slow down. It forced him to try and anticipate his opponent's potential responses, to mentally map out the consequences of his own actions before he touched a piece.
So the inherent structure of the game rules and turn-taking provided the kind of internal discipline that he was lacking. He was essentially learning strategic planning, foresight, and cognitive inhibition in a way that was engaging, maybe even high stakes for him, not just an abstract classroom lecture.
Totally. And the reported long-term outcome was pretty phenomenal. His grades, particularly in mathematics, improved significantly, likely because he learned those problem categorization and planning skills we just discussed. And maybe just as importantly, he gained much better control over his impulses in the classroom. He learned to pause, to think before speaking or acting out. Chess, for him, provided this concrete framework that taught him executive functions that are notoriously difficult to instill through abstract instruction alone. It seemed to transform him from a student really struggling with chaos to one who was becoming disciplined in strategic thinking. Okay, this journey naturally moves us into the adult world and the modern equivalent of the brain gym, digital brain training apps. Now, it's really easy to be cynical about these platforms, right? There's been controversy, but the most effective apps out there today actually manage to successfully marry solid cognitive science principles with highly effective user engagement design.
Absolutely. And it's crucial to understand that even among the leading platforms, say Elevate versus Lumosity, there's often a profound difference in their core pedagogical philosophy. They aren't necessarily trying to achieve the exact same goal for the user. Let's take Elevate. Its focus is almost exclusively on functional skills. These are cognitive abilities you apply directly in your day-to-day professional and personal life. Things like enhancing communication clarity, writing more concisely, speaking more effectively, improving numerical fluency, doing calculations faster in your head, boosting critical thinking skills while reading reports or articles. The games themselves are often structured to mimic these real-world tasks. You might be editing, writing samples for conciseness, solving applied math problems, or identifying logical fallacies and arguments. So using Elevate often feels more like using a productivity tool or having a personalized coach for practical skills. The aim is measurable, actionable intelligence for the real world.
Okay, that's Elevate focusing on functional real-world application. What about Lumosity? How does it differ?
Lumosity takes a different approach. It tends to focus more on training foundational cognitive systems, building up your core mental muscle, if you will. So it's games, target areas like working memory capacity, visual and spatial awareness, processing speed, and sustained attention. The games are generally more abstract. They're often rooted heavily in classic experimental psychology tasks or paradigms. For instance, they might use variations of the NBAC test to push your working memory, or adapt something like the flanker task to train your selective attention and ability to ignore distractions. Using Lumosity often feels much more like you're training inside a standardized cognitive science laboratory environment.
That difference in approach must really influence how users perceive the benefits, right?
It does, significantly. User feedback often suggests that with Lumosity, people feel they get really, really good at playing the specific Lumosity minigames. The transfer to broader real-world skills isn't always immediately obvious to users. Whereas with Elevate, because its training exercises often directly mimic real-world tasks like editing a document or quickly estimating costs, users often report a more immediate perceived transfer benefit. They feel a tangible edge in their professional communication or quicker decision-making in everyday situations. So the choice between them, or others like them, really needs to align perfectly with your specific cognitive goals. Are you trying to improve your writing speed or boost your fundamental attention capacity? They target different things.
Right, the underlying science and the targeted skills are one part of the equation. But the app itself has to be compelling enough to keep people coming back. An app based on perfect science is useless if you stop using it after 3 days because it's boring or frustrating.
Absolutely critical point. The user experience design must be intrinsically rewarding to maintain high compliance, which is essential for results. Elements like personalized progress bars showing your improvement, tracking daily streaks, achieving mastery levels in different skills, getting positive and encouraging feedback. These are all critical psychological levers for keeping users engaged over the long term. The app needs to integrate principles of behavioral psychology effectively to prevent that inevitable drop-off. And this even influences their marketing and motivational pitch. Elevate, for example, heavily emphasizes life gain. Its messaging constantly reinforces the idea that the training will make you better at things outside the app, writing that clearer email, giving a more persuasive presentation, understanding complex reports faster. Lumosity historically has often focused more on brain gain, the idea of making your brain itself sharper, faster, more agile, often demonstrated by improved scores within the game world. Additionally, there can be differences in the business model. Elevate, for instance, often provides more generous access to free daily training sessions, which lowers the initial barrier for entry and might make forming that initial habit a little easier for some users.
So whether the focus is functional skills or foundational systems, the ultimate transformation hinges less on the intensity of any single session and much more on repetition over time. Consistency seems to be the real secret sauce here.
That is absolutely the consensus, and it draws directly from all the plasticity research we discussed earlier with cognitive reserve. Daily cognitive engagement, even if it's just in brief, highly focused bursts, say 5 or 10 minutes, is scientifically shown to be more effective for improving executive function and boosting neural efficiency than doing infrequent, long marathon training sessions. The brain seems to thrive on that regular rhythmic stimulation to consolidate learning and reinforce those newly forged or strengthened neural pathways. Little and often beats cramming.
Okay, so consistency is key. But life gets busy. How do we maximize the chances of actually achieving that consistency? What are the practical strategies?
The most effective behavioral strategy is often habit stacking. This comes from behavioral science. Instead of trying to carve out a completely new, isolated 15-minute slot in your already hectic day, which is hard to maintain, you link the new behavior, the brain training session, to an existing, already established routine. So for example, you commit to doing your cognitive training session immediately before you have your first cup of coffee in the morning, or maybe during the last 5 minutes of your train commute before you get off, or right after you brush your teeth at night. By linking it to something you already do automatically, the brain training starts to become part of that expected, almost automatic daily compliance ritual, rather than something extra you have to remember and motivate yourself to do.
That makes perfect sense. Anchor the new habit to an old one. And this brings us to the story of Maya, a marketing professional. Maya was experiencing that feeling many of us can relate to, that sense of mental dulling that can creep in after years of digital distraction, constant multitasking, information overload. She felt her thinking was sluggish. She was struggling with word recall during meetings, feeling overwhelmed by complex client pitches. Her cognitive edge felt like it was eroding. So Maya decided to try a cognitive training app. She started using it during her 10-minute commute each way, turning that previously passive time into a focused, deliberate mental exercise. Importantly, she wasn't looking for some massive IQ jump or a miracle cure. Her goal was more modest but deeply personal. She just wanted to reclaim that feeling of being sharp, focused, and mentally agile that she felt she'd lost. The app she chose likely focused on those functional skills, maybe communication, processing speed, critical thinking, providing quick, satisfying games, visible metrics of her progress, and immediate feedback that felt relevant to her professional challenges. And the results weren't about overnight transformation. She didn't instantly get a promotion or become a genius, but she started noticing these small yet profound improvements in her daily life. She found she had better word recall during fast-paced brainstorming sessions. Her ability to quickly filter relevant information from dense reports seemed to improve. She even mentioned, maybe half-jokingly, that she started winning at Scrabble again, against her partner, A small, enjoyable sign, perhaps, that her verbal fluency and processing speed were genuinely getting better. For Maya, the app provided tangible evidence that she was actively regaining cognitive control. It turned her commute, which used to be dead time, into this quiet, consistent, and ultimately rewarding act of self-improvement. So if we zoom out and try to summarize everything we've covered, it seems clear that from the microscopic scale of synaptic plasticity and BDNF production, all the way up to the macroscopic scale of a student's academic discipline, or an aging individual's ability to maintain their identity and function, strategic mental engagement is fundamentally an essential adaptation strategy across the entire human lifespan.
It really is. The synthesis of this deep dive is, I think, quite clear. Cognitive reserve provides this powerful biological resilience. It enables the brain to compensate, sometimes astonishingly well, for even severe underlying pathology. This resilience is biologically fueled by the brain's inherent capacity for plasticity, its ability to rewire itself. And that plasticity, in turn, is chemically sustained and supported by crucial neurotrophic factors like BDNF. And importantly, we now know we can significantly influence these processes through deliberate lifestyle choices, cognitive challenge, physical activity, and diet. This foundational principle then gets applied strategically across different life stages. In schools, structured strategic games like chess offer a concrete framework for training vital executive functions and highly specific problem-solving skills, helping to bridge that critical gap between theoretical knowledge and practical execution. And then, in adulthood, digital brain training apps can be effective tools for maintaining or even enhancing specific functional skills, provided the user commits to consistent, continuous engagement and chooses a tool that aligns with their specific cognitive goals.
It seems the journey we took, starting from that simple Sudoku puzzle my friend was obsessing over, and going all the way through neurobiology, educational studies, and app design, it really confirms that our brains aren't these static machines we're born with. They're much more like gardens. Gardens that require constant cultivation, strategic tending, and wise investment throughout our lives.
I think that's a perfect analogy. And perhaps the final thought to leave with is this. The evidence we've discussed strongly suggests that the simple act of deliberately focusing our minds on strategic play, whether it's a chessboard, learning a new language, mastering an instrument, or engaging with a dedicated daily digital challenge, it's not just a distraction from life. It's not a trivial pastime. It is perhaps one of the most fundamental ways we actively invest in the future efficiency, the flexibility, and the resilience of the very machine that processes, remembers, and ultimately defines our reality.